What is an INFP? These four letters stand for introverted, intuitive, feeling, and perceiving in the Myers-Briggs personality typing system, which was based on the psychologist Carl Jung's theory of the cognitive functions. An INFP is someone who prefers to use the cognitive functions introverted feeling, extroverted intuition, introverted sensing, and extroverted thinking, roughly in that order of frequency, and we'll get into what each function does a bit later. But first, you've probably heard that the INFP is romantic, sensitive, creative, caring, bubbly, and someone who has strong personal values. In reality, any type may possess those characteristics while an actual INFP might not. Why? Well, because those are personality traits, which are characteristics that can change over time and can be consciously developed. Think of it as the content of personality. The content can change depending on what you put into it, which may include culture, upbringing, personal experiences, and so on. Carl Jung was not focused on personality traits, but personality types, a classification system that does not change over time. Since it is fixed, it has to offer enough flexibility to account for the variations within, the variation being the diverse content of personality traits. So think of personality type as the structure that is capable of containing a variety of content. Certain structures may lead to certain content, but correlation does not equal causation. So what is this structure? In short, it's your system of information digestion. It's how you tend to perceive, retain, organize, and prioritize information. This is denoted by your cognitive functions. At no point should these cognitive functions be confused with universal biological and executive functions like the five senses and planning for the future. Alright, now let's get into it. The INFP's strongest function is FI, which is oriented inwards and inhabits the feeling domain. FI is a judging function, so it has to do with how the INFP prioritizes information. In this case, as an introvert, they spend a lot of time checking in with themselves and their inner world, and may neglect or spend much less time being attuned to the external world, whether that's to sensory delights, other people, or external rules. They spend most of their psychological time looking inward at their personal feelings. They're extremely perceptive to their own emotional response, whether that's to objects, people, experiences, their other feelings, and even lines of reasoning. This doesn't mean that the INFP is an over-emotional wreck all the time. Subtle emotions are involved as well. There are not only emotions of happiness or sadness, but shades of mild annoyance, being slighted, a sense of justice, or the feeling that something isn't quite right. Over time, the INFP collects a vast array of personal feeling and knowledge about these feelings, which acts as a compass to help the INFP with their decision making. Once again, this doesn't mean that the INFP is constantly doing what feels good. There's an immense complexity to the feelings. For example, the feeling that something doesn't feel great in the moment, but it feels like a necessity, and thus doing it would provide relief. Of course, feelings of right and wrong or justice and injustice are also par for the course, giving the INFP personal values and convictions that are emotionally driven at the core. Let's also talk about what the INFP is not. They hold their personal feelings near and dear to heart and do not like it when external pressure tells them to change these feelings. This could be a local custom or even just a friend trying to cheer them up through emotional means. Generally, they see emotion as still rather than in motion. Their collection of feeling belong in a museum. New artifacts occasionally come and go, but the structure is generally static. Feelings are to be preserved and analyzed, not flung around towards people in certain situations. Though it isn't externally obvious, the INFP actually has a good intuitive knowledge of the appropriate ways in which to display emotion. However, they generally dislike using this skill and would much rather, as they see it, stay true to their inner feelings at all times. Situations where the INFP has to suppress or fake their emotions always leads to internal friction, which can appear awkward externally. Compounding all of this is the INFP's other introverted function, SI. SI is a perceiving function, governing how one retains and structures information. SI is meticulous in retaining sensory events, objects, and details. Being introverted, it subjectivizes these elements. In order to make sense of all the concrete information, it catalogs them, connecting experiences together. SI isn't very strong in the INFP, so they don't have the most interconnected of internal sensory information. This means that they might forget some past events, forget to do something, or mess up on the details. However, everything that they do remember and categorize is connected to FI. Usually, this means that the sensory experiences that trigger FI will also be more likely to be retained by SI. When it comes to random information, the INFP has a knack for retaining bits and pieces that they personally find interesting. They usually have very detailed memories of interpersonal relationships, particularly the more emotionally intense moments. Unfortunately, this means that they can occasionally get stuck emotionally analyzing a few pieces of the past without having the whole picture. Together, FI and SI make up the INFP's unique inner world. They create the overwhelming sense that all emotional experiences and specific concrete experiences are all related. This makes the INFP emotionally triggered by very specific occurrences. Say someone used bad spelling and it reminds the INFP of several people in the past who also had bad spelling. The INFP would dig up all the associated feelings. Moreover, the SI makes the FI book of values quite detailed. It's not a general situation or general progression of events that makes them feel a certain way, it's all the nitty-gritty components. This often makes the INFP quite articulate about their feelings and inner experiences, as they're usually able to trace their feelings to specific concrete things. This may be partly why so many INFPs are drawn to writing, since it involves using the precise tool of language to articulate intangible feelings. Generally, SI is more of a conscious process. While feelings can be messy, SI meticulously helps label each shade of feeling and arrange it within the internal structure. While SI can potentially retain a lot of sensory experiences, they are by nature fragmented since the intuitive context is lost. This often creates some leeway to rearrange sensory fragments at will. This comes especially naturally to the INFP since they have weaker SI. Since their sensory perception is weak in the first place and all of it is oriented inwards, the INFP can be seriously unaware of their sensory surroundings. This problem is actually compounded by strong NE, which I'll explain shortly. NE is the INFP's first and most active point of contact with the outside world. NE is a perceiving function, experiencing the world as possibilities and potential rather than concrete externalities. Moreover, being extroverted, it doesn't retain anything, so there's no sense of certain ideas being contradictory. Anything can happen all at once. Thus, they can have an entire paradigm shift just by shifting their perspective, even if no concrete object in external space has shifted. This tends to make the INFP rather passive when it comes to exhibiting external force. Instead of going out and physically molding objects to their liking, the INFP is all too happy to sit back and imagine. Whether it's mastering an external object or overpowering others, the INFP generally has no interest. They are much more likely to master a craft or experience external sensory objects through the lens of how it makes them feel internally, rather than how it physically manifests out in external objective reality. Drifting in the internal world feels so comforting that left to their own devices, the INFP may forget to use NE without prompting, even though their NE is rather strong. The strength of the INFP's NE is evident when they're in the midst of projects and situations that demand them to come up with a variety of ideas. The speed with which they do so is often impressive, producing one wild idea after the other. The INFP is creative, but often it's not a useful creativity unless they apply discipline with TE, which we'll get into later. Basically, the INFP plays with ideas for the sake of it. To them, that feels more real than actually materializing it into tangible reality, actually building that model airplane or living out that fantasy life in their head. So, although the INFP is brimming with ideas, They don't often spill out into their lives. The INFP often forgets their gift of multifaceted perception in the living of everyday life, even though this is ideally the first thing to do if they're ever stuck in a rut. What compounds this effect is that as an introverted type, it takes tremendous energy for the INFP to inhabit the external world for prolonged periods of time, and when they do interact with the world, they greatly prefer to do it through intuitive perception, that is, observing rather than shaping the world. Or, perhaps more accurately, they feel like they are shaping the world through shifting their perception of it. What's a blessing is often also a curse. Because the INFP has such a multifaceted view of the world and its infinite possibilities, it can be hard to settle on one perspective or choice. It can be hard to determine the most likely course of events, as well as predict things such as people's hidden motives. Often, the INFP has correct inklings of how things will unfold, but this voice is drowned out by hundreds of other scenarios. All of this can make it hard for the INFP to make a decision and stay the course for long before NE decides that another possibility is more enticing. The reason why INFPs meet any objectives is probably thanks to their inferior function, TE. TE is a judging function using external information, usually empirical logic, as a means to an end. TE structures the external world based on what makes sense in the moment, based on what works. Although TE is the INFP's weakest function, it shouldn't be underestimated because the weakness of the inferior function usually creates an insecurity, a preoccupation. Repression tends to lead to fixation. Many INFPs have a love or hate relationship with TE. On one hand, they're afraid to use it since any sort of conforming to external criteria and rules would feel like an affront to their unique FI. On the other hand, when life isn't working out so well, they crave the ability to use TE like an expert. Generally, when things don't go right, their lack of TE is the first thing they blame, whether that instinct is accurate or not. Many INFPs have experienced the feeling of missing out on opportunities, not meeting their potential, and being illusioned with the world since it doesn't live up to their rigorous inner ideals. If only they could prioritize what's objective and logical and do what works, but then they wouldn't be INFP. This is not to say that INFPs can't apply logic at all. On the contrary, many are quite good at it, picking up fields like math and science quite effortlessly with their dual perception, their NE conceptual grasp, and SI precision. However, outside of isolated instances, when we're talking about the messiness of real life, the INFP almost never prioritizes logic when it comes to decision making. Insecurity often leads to overcompensation. Ironically, the INFP may even criticize other people for slip-ups in the TE realm, for example, not grasping the rules properly in a game. Unless the INFP is under a lot of stress, this fortunately usually only happens within the field of expertise of the INFP. They could have mastered a way of doing something that they perceive as objectively logical, whether that's a procedure or their job or hobby. When other people fail to be as adept, it reminds the INFP of their own insufficiencies in other realms, prompting the attack. Another way the INFP could overcompensate is by using logic to justify emotionally based decisions. Combined with their precise SI articulation, they might even come across as logical at times. Being an introverted type, they could possibly store many lines of reasoning together into something that at times even resembles TI, or an internal logical framework. But be not fooled, it's simply the INFP trying to appeal to TE by using it in conjunction with their FI. With time, they'll be able to strengthen their TE, but it'll still follow the lead of FI. Think you might be an INFP but not sure? Find out your type once and for all through my typing service, available on cognitive8.com. We analyze your subconscious visual and auditory cues so that you can cut through the stereotypes. To support more videos like this and join me in group chat, please visit my Patreon. Thanks for watching.